Yay! So here are a few images. I really enjoy this one. I saw it very recently, the new take on American Gothic called The New American Gothic. This is by an artist named Criselda Vasquez. This portrait right here is a self-portrait from the artist Fritz Scholder, and he's an American Indian artist. But, you know, concepts of the American Indian draped in the American flag are a little bit subversive. Of course, Dorothea Lange very famously took images of hardship in rural America during the Great Depression. And this is a cartoon. There's a series of cartoons that illustrate the Monkey Wrench Gang, a very famous novel about environmental reactions to environmental degradation in the West. So there have been lots of critiques of rural America, just as much as celebrations. So certainly one of the words that came up here is land and open spaces when we were thinking about rural. And land ownership is essential to our concept of rural America. It's equivalent to independence and prosperity within the American system, and we have an appreciation of open lands and unobstructed views. The land gives us a sense of place, but it's also home to finite resources that create a lot of tensions, and in the West we know these to be true. Myriad examples, you know, the dams on the Snake River, sage grouse, is sage grouse more important than grazing, access to federal lands, all of these things come to mind. And of course, the hardships of living in rural America are very real. Work can be hard to find, poorly paid, seasonal, or physically demanding, and discrimination can be felt very acutely. So I found this really interesting set of research. It was done in 2018, so it's pretty recent. It was a poll conducted by NPR, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the Harvard School of Public Health in collaboration. And they found, I'll quote here, that although discrimination has recently become a prominent part of the national conversation, most rural Americans polled said that minority groups do not face discrimination in their community. Two exceptions are transgender people and recent immigrants to the U.S. However, despite low recognition of discrimination among all rural Americans, rural adults that actually belong to a minority group, specifically called out here are Latinos and African Americans, they report seeing much higher rates of discrimination against members of their group. This suggests a sizable gap between how minorities and non-minorities believe people are treated in their rural communities. So that's a really key concept there. But I do think it's notable that respondents under the age of 50 actually had a higher likelihood of acknowledging that discrimination existed in their rural communities when compared to their older counterparts. So I do think that change is afoot in rural America, and there is a growing recognition of disparities in treatment. But these are some of the areas that are really called out in the Smithsonian exhibit that were areas of major change in the 20th century. So education was one. Can anybody think of how education changed in the last 100 years? Any examples?
Land grant system?
The land grant university system, and that's something that universities like Washington State and the University of Idaho recently have been leaning into more. They really want to explore what the land grant mission should mean and how they are really servicing their local communities rather than being any other sort of Research One institution.
Community colleges?
The growth of community colleges, and I would say in very recent years, there's been a resurgence of interest in apprenticeship sorts of programs or trade schools, but certainly throughout the 90s and 2000s, there was kind of a dip in that interest, and we're seeing the results of that we don't have enough skilled craftsmen in our areas, and certainly anybody who wanted to have a house built in Moscow would know that we have a shortage of contractors. So there is an education gap that exists there.
There really wasn't until the 1940s until women started to graduate from high school at any kind of commensurate grades, and it really wasn't graduating from high school at all didn't really change very much until the 1960s.
So the breakdown of gender in our graduating classes from secondary ed, yeah, I mean, that was a huge change. And then that trickled down, right? Because then that affected the sorts of work that women could get. It affected how families were living at home. Some of the other things that came to my mind, consolidation of rural schools, that's a big thing in our part of the world. And any community that lost their rural school really lost the heart of their community. And it's really difficult for towns to survive when their school has been consolidated. And if you look at the communities that are thriving now in Latah County, they're all ones that have retained their schools. The towns that weren't able to hold on to it, we really don't know much of, they're not destination locations anymore. The defunding of higher ed has been an ongoing issue, and rising costs of higher education. So access to services is another place that we've seen a lot of change. Similarly to rural schools, rural hospitals and rural medical practices, that we've seen contract quite a bit. So that has really affected life in rural America. Conversely, we have new opportunities granted to us through access to the internet, and so we have more information available to us. And another very specific example that comes to my mind would be the extension service, and as it developed, particularly after the Great Depression, the different services that they've provided in rural communities have been really critical. And you look at the extension service throughout Idaho and how much it provides in communities, not just Latah County, but all over the state. Commerce, we've seen a lot of change there. Divestment in main streets is probably the most visible one, and anybody who's been in Moscow for any amount of time, I'm sure will note the change of character of downtown Moscow. We certainly, I think, are at a high watermark right now in recent years, given, there's very few empty storefronts, but they're not department stores like they used to be. So the composition of downtown has changed. Agriculture, we've seen increase in production, which has been coupled by a decreased need of labor. You can grow more food with fewer people, and that has certainly changed who lives in rural areas and who farms, and also the consolidation of land holdings. We did a tour of a Century Farm earlier this summer. The Historical Society did at a property outside of Genesee. And that farm, I think the farmer said that they farm just over 2,000 acres, and it's two of them. It's a father and son. That's all it takes. During harvest, they might have a couple extra people driving truck, but that's the totality of the people it takes to farm that much land. And when you think that an original homestead was 160 acres and maybe only 20 or 40 of those were being cultivated, and it took a whole family to do that. That's certainly been a major change in the last 100 years. Infrastructure, we've got probably the big one is the advent of the interstate and how that has changed commerce, how that has changed travel. And we know in our neck of the woods that a lack of investment in infrastructure is really a challenge. When we don't have solid roads, when we don't have safe bridges, it really impedes our ability to grow our economies. And finally, demographic change, and I think this comes back kind of to what you were saying, Liz. There has been a major shift in demographics in rural America. I think we happen to live in a part where it's less visible, but if you were to look at rural America as a whole, we've seen major changes due to the Great Migration of African Americans out of the South in the 19-teens and 20s to jobs in northern factories. The Great Depression, there was certainly an out-migration of folks from the middle of the country to the coast. And certainly many more migrant labors than we have had in the past, although a dependence on migrant labor has existed in America for far more than 100 years. But we are seeing it in new parts of the country.
Elsie?
Yeah.
And not to hammer on this,
No, go ahead.
because I know we're sort of celebrating rural America, but in terms of the demographic changes, I moved to Idaho from Colorado in the early, well, in 1978, and I lived for 5 years before that around Orofino, either in Orofino or in rural areas around Lenore. And so my neighbors called the native women there smoked meat. And when there was a black family that came along the highway and stopped at the store at Lenore, the entire community came out and lined the highway to watch. So it was
That wasn't
not not a welcoming community to anybody of color. So, you know, we had a huge conversation around how to address redefining racism. And I think that is an enormous conversation that needs to happen. And it is not addressed well by saying everything is peachy. And that all people of color are welcome in rural towns, which they are not.
No, they don't.
And that is not gone, not in Moscow, not in Idaho.
Certainly.
I think it's covered by white, white privilege, because we don't see what happens to the other side of the road. We only see ourselves. And unless you open yourself up to that, my husband is from Iran, and so we see a lot more discrimination than the average person. And you talk to someone that is white or appears white, they have no idea. They think it doesn't exist. But it exists. I tell you, it really exists. And Native Americans is another good example. They stay in their own group. They go to their own churches. They go to their own stores. And as a society, we like that because it keeps them away from our vision.
It is a disadvantage of rural America to live in a place with a small population because it's easy to ignore diversity because we don't have a large pool of people to interact with day in and day out. So that is most definitely, and I don't want to give the illusion that everything is Pollyanna either. The goal of this exhibition was primarily to dispel the myth that rural America is dying. So I think that there are competing myths about rural America. Some are more accurate than others, and there are competing challenges that we're facing. If we don't lean into our diversity, that will become, then we're missing an opportunity to strengthen our communities. And I make that point often when I say, just look at the history of Lake County and Moscow. We had all sorts of folks who came here. It hasn't always been homogenous. We want to believe it has been. But it hasn't, and there's lots in the historic record to point that out. And we've been stronger for it. So, as a historian, I have to be somewhat careful about how I present historic information and give people the opportunity to make a decision. But if you can show that there's been diversity for 120 years in Latah County, after white folks arrived, and we've been better for it, to me that is as far as I can take my job. People have to make that decision on their own. But what were you going to say, Joanne?
Oh, speaking of what you're saying, that hidden discrimination, the Moscow Human Rights Commission is trying to start something so that people who have faced discrimination can authenticate it. It doesn't rise to, let's go to the police, so you don't know about it. And we're going to have a place online where you could, if you face discrimination, you can mention it, document it, that's what I'm thinking. So I just wanted to
That sounds
say
like a really important tool.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah. An example that comes to my mind is speaking with Claire Chin in the past. And, the reason that her parents were the owners of the restaurant, the New Hong Kong Cafe, was because her, I believe I remember the story correctly, her father had an engineering degree from Washington State University, but couldn't find employment as an engineer. And so they went into the restaurant business because that was the employment that was available to somebody, no matter how highly skilled, if that was their ethnic or their ethnicity. So, and that was, you want to say it was a long time ago, but it wasn't. It was, 50, 60 years ago. So I certainly understand what you're saying. So, I promised a quick run-through of the major forces of change in my talk description. So we're going to do 100 years of history, actually more than 100 years of history.